Hello everyone, welcome back to another Geostats lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to talk about our last piece of the global spatial autocorrelation, and that is the Moran's I test statistic. Right, the Moran's I test statistic. And so up to this point, right, we've talked about neighborhood connectivity, we've talked about the spatial weights matrix, we've talked about lagged means and the lagged mean plot. And we said that all of these could, well, the lagged mean plot at least, could give us an indication of spatial autocorrelation. But we have yet to talk about sort of a test in the traditional sense of, hey, we're going to calculate a test statistic and get some p-values. So probably the most widely used test statistic for spatial autocorrelation is this Moran's I. And I actually am just now realizing that I forgot the I here. Forgot the I here. This should be I equals. Right, so Moran's I is the go-to test statistic for spatial autocorrelation. And what I want to do in this video is just like in all of the others that we've gone through of this nature is break down this equation, talk about what parts it's got, what each part means, and sort of what the overall test statistic is trying to indicate. So let's talk at first about what we have here. So this n right here, right, this is the number of observations. Right, so this would be the number of polygons, for example, right? This Wi, Wj, right, this is the sum of the spatial weights matrix. Okay, right, so this sum I, sum j, right, this is the sum of the spatial weights matrix. So if you remember back to our spatial weights matrix, which was set up where we had a 1 if it was considered adjacent, either through the rook's case or the queen's case, and a 0 if it wasn't. Right, if we sum up all of those ones, right, that's what this is right here. So you can imagine the more connectivity we have, the larger and larger and larger the sum of this connectivity matrix is going to be relative to the number of observations. So this whole term here will get smaller and smaller and smaller. So the more connected our data set is, the smaller this front term will become. Okay. So over here we see the sum of the weights matrix again. But in this case, we're multiplying it by the difference from, actually, before we do that, this Zi right here, right, this is the data value of the ith observation. Right, we've seen these Z's before when we were talking about lagged means. Right, so this is the actual data value. So when we go through our videos, we'll talk about the Georgia percent rural data. So this would be the percent of rural population in a given county for the Georgia data set. It could be the rate of lung cancer in the Pennsylvania lung cancer data set. If you're looking at, that's a pretty popular textbook data set, right? It could be the amount of crime in a given census tract, right? It could be anything. Right? This is your real world data that you're interested in. Okay, I'm running out of colors here. This Z bar, right? Anytime you see a bar above something, that's generally an indication that this is the average of the values of the data value. My data value looks really sloppy here. This is the average of the data value. Right, so this is just the mean, right? There's nothing new here or complicated here. Right, so anytime you see the zi, right, that's what that's indicating. Right, if you see zi, that's what that's indicating. Anytime you see the wij here, right, that's what that's indicating. So what about zj? Right, zj is really simple. It's the same thing as this. It's just the data value of the jth observation. Right. So hopefully I didn't make this too messy that we can't follow along here. But the idea here, right, the first one, right, the more connected our matrix is, right, the smaller this first term becomes, right? The less connected our matrix is, the larger this first term becomes, right? Because the number of observations is static, right? As we increase the connectivity of a given set, this will become smaller, which will make the whole Moran's I smaller. But let's talk about this for a second. What's happening over here? What's happening on this side? I'm going to just hopefully not muddy the waters too much here. I'm just going to put a crash day line here. So this side, I'm talking about this side, right? So what's happening over here? Well, the bottom here, right, this is this term squared. This top part is this term times this term. So what happens when we have really high spatial autocorrelation? What happens when our data values and our neighboring polygons are strongly influenced? Well, we would expect that neighboring, right? Because again, this is WIWJ. This is controlling. So if it's not adjacent, right, this whole term is gone. This whole thing becomes 0. But if they are adjacent, right, if the value of the weights matrix is 1, then we're going to include this in the calculation. Hopefully that makes sense, right? For a given observation, right, we're adding up all of its neighbors. So if the values become more similar to their neighbors, right, this comes closer to 1, right? Because if zi and zj are the same, right, then this becomes zi minus z's average squared. So the closer these values are to each other, this will become closer to 1. The farther these values are apart, right, the more this will deviate from 1. So hopefully that makes sense, right? As zi and zj approach each other, this top term begins to look a lot more like this bottom term. So this whole thing will approach 1. Right? If these values are different from each other's, right, then this will start to deviate away from 1. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's talk about the actual values of Moran's I for just a second. I want to give this a little bit, right? So let's talk about Moran's I, right? The I statistic. Let's not use that color. Let's use a better color, right? The I statistic, right? So what is it measuring? Right, it's measuring the magnitude right up here. This is 2 different observations. So the closer they are, again, the closer this goes to 1. The farther apart they are, the farther away this deviates from 1. Right, so this is a measure of the difference between values and their neighboring polygons' values relative to the values of the polygons themselves. So this is similar to that lagged means. It's just taking into account, it's a little more complicated. So how do we actually interpret Moran's I? Well, the larger the Moran's I, the more important spatial autocorrelation is in the data set. Right? The larger the Moran's I, the more important spatial autocorrelation is in the data set. Now, I'm going to put an asterisk here. Right? And the asterisk is the range, right? The range of possible Moran's I values depends on the spatial weights matrix. Right? And we can see that, right? We can see that here, right? This Wij. So the thing with Moran's I, right? It's not like a Pearson's correlation coefficient, which is -1 to 1, right? Moran's I, the range is sort of dependent on the input data. So determining whether or not this is a large Moran's I depends on the range of possible values, which depends on the spatial weights matrix. So what we're going to do in the R videos is we'll actually show you a way to figure out the range. It's a little too complicated to go through, especially with all of the matrix algebra involved. It's a little too complicated to go through here, but suffice it to say we can figure out the range of possible Moran's I's, and then we can use that to go back and interpret the I value with the idea that the larger the Moran's I, the more important spatial autocorrelation is. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. And in the next video, we're going to go through the p-value tests and the actual tests that we can run to determine whether or not this I value is statistically significant. So hopefully this all made sense. If any of this was confusing, I encourage you to pause the video, go back, and as always, please reach out. Thank you.